March 22nd, 1994, a 40-year-old, very experienced airline pilot named Andrei Danilov walked into the cockpit of a huge airplane that he was about to fly out of Moscow. Once he was in the cockpit, he said hello to the two other pilots he'd be flying with that night, and then Andrei took a seat in the captain's chair. Now, this flight tonight was going to be a very routine 13-hour trip to Hong Kong, something Andrei and these other two pilots had done many times before. But this night, Andrei was totally dreading this trip because one of the pilots he'd be flying with that night was a guy that Andrei just could not stand. His name was Yaroslav Kudrinsky, and he was going to be the relief pilot that night. So Andrei is the captain and the primary pilot. He has a co-pilot or first officer who sits right next to him, and then behind those two would be Yaroslav, the relief pilot, who basically is just there in case the captain or first officer needed a break. And so basically, Andrei was going to be forced to interact with Yaroslav all night long. And so as passengers made their way onto the plane, and as Andrei went through his pre-check procedures to get ready for this flight, Yaroslav just started yapping away about how amazing he was and what a great dad he was because he brought his kids on this flight. You know, they hadn't done a big international flight before, and so he was letting them fly with him that night. And then also Yaroslav began talking about this big surprise he had for his kids that was really going to show what an incredible father he really was. Now, Andrei and the first officer were listening to Yaroslav, but they were basically just completely ignoring him. They're not responding to him, they're not feeding into what he's saying, but Yaroslav didn't care. He just kept on rambling on and on and on about how amazing he was. And so finally, Andrei got clearance to take off. And so even though Yaroslav was totally annoying him, he was able to take off, and they went up to their cruising altitude, and they began making their way towards Hong Kong. And the whole time, Yaroslav's just going on and on and on. And finally, 5 hours into this trip, Yaroslav is still just going on and on and on. And Andrei has just had it. He cannot stand to be around this guy anymore. And so finally, Andrei turned around and just cut off Yaroslav, who was mid-sentence about some anecdote about how strong his son was and what a talented wrestler he was. And so Andrei just cuts him off and is like, Yaroslav, take over. I'm taking a break. I'm going to go sleep for a bit. And so Yaroslav would stop what he was doing. He would stand up. He would take his seat in the captain's chair, and he would take over flying the plane. And so Andrei got up. He left the cockpit. He went to the very back of the plane in the main cabin to this row of seats that was reserved for him and the other pilots. And he got in there, and he laid down, and he closed his eyes. But just a couple of minutes after closing his eyes, Andrei began to feel the plane begin to bank hard to one side. Now, Andrei couldn't really remember if this was the time they were supposed to be turning or not, but it just felt like this turn was more aggressive than anything he anticipated at any point in this journey. But Andrei knew this plane was brand new, and so if there were any kind of minor mistakes that Yaroslav was making flying the plane, well, the autopilot feature, which was state-of-the-art in this plane, would easily correct those small errors and keep the plane going towards its destination. And so, even though, again, they're still in this pretty sharp turn here, Andrei just closed his eyes again and tried to go to sleep. But a couple of minutes later, they were still banking, and in fact, the bank was starting to get even more aggressive, to the point where Andrei opened his eyes and he's thinking to himself, what is Yaroslav doing up there? Like, we're basically going in a circle at this point. We're spiraling midair. And so right as Andrei was about to get up and go see what the heck was going on, the plane began to shake really violently, and suddenly Andrei realized, oh my goodness, the plane could be stalling right now. There could be a real issue in the cockpit, and this is not some minor error. And so as passengers on the plane are starting to sense that something could be wrong here, I mean, the plane is like hard to the side and shaking, so people are starting to scream and cry, people are nervous. And so Andrei, he begins to stand up to go to the cockpit when suddenly the plane goes from just shaking and banking to basically rolling completely on its side. So all the windows are now on the ground and everybody's on their side. Andrei knew he could not go to the cockpit. There was no way to do that. And so all he could do was just hold on to his seat and pray they got out of this. And then just as quickly as all this started, it stopped. The plane kind of went back to level, it stopped shaking, and then Andrei heard the sound of the twin engines out on the wings roar as if the plane was kind of getting back up to speed, and for a second, it seemed like everything was okay. And so Andre, sensing that this was his chance to get back to the cockpit and frankly just reassume command, because whatever was going on in there, it was not okay. And so Andre, he got up and began running down the aisle to get to the cockpit. But right as he was about to grab the door, the plane suddenly tilted upward and they began rocketing up into the sky, so strong that Andre was pinned to the carpet. And so for a couple of seconds, Andre couldn't do anything, but then he began to hear the sound of the actual frame of the plane beginning to crack from all the pressure of accelerating so quickly up into the sky. And so with all of his strength, Andre reached up, he's on his hands and knees, and he grabs the door handle to the cockpit and he opens it up, and the second he looks into the cockpit, he would have known exactly what was wrong. It would turn out Yaroslav's big surprise for his kids that he promised Andre and the first officer would demonstrate what an amazing father he was that he was going to let his kids fly the plane just for a second. But these are untrained children that have no idea how to fly a plane. And so when Andre got up and went to go take a nap and Yaroslav took over, well, Yaroslav called up his kids who were in the main cabin, a teenage son and daughter, and they went into the cockpit and they sat down in the captain's chair and they began to fly the plane. And the daughter took the seat first in the captain's chair, and she was very careful not to touch any of the controls, even though Yaroslav was kind of encouraging her, to take the wheel and really see what it feels like. But she was nervous, and so she really didn't touch anything. But then Yaroslav's son, when he sat down in the captain's chair, he did grab the controls and he pulled on the wheel hard enough that he somehow disengaged the autopilot feature, and nobody noticed. And so as Yaroslav's son is yanking forward and backwards on the yoke, so the steering wheel of the plane began going in all these crazy directions because there was no autopilot to stop it. And by the time he had figured out what was wrong, it was too late because the plane had entered into an unrecoverable stall and it crashed into the foothills of Siberia, killing all 75 people on board. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. Back in 2018, I was very depressed. I had just left the military and I was really struggling to re-assimilate back into civilian society, and it was making me depressed. And even though I was encouraged from a young age to open up and talk about my feelings when I was feeling down, as an adult, I just couldn't do it. I felt very insecure about it and was worried if I began talking about my problems that I would be viewed as kind of a weak person, or even worse, a complainer, something I was very worried about. But eventually I would go seek out a therapist because I became so miserable and it just had to happen. And I'm so glad I did, because as soon as I actually talked to a real therapist, I saw therapy is actually kind of great. As soon as you open up and kind of unburden yourself, a trained therapist can really help you work through your issues and come to terms with them. And over time, you'll get better. And so that's why today I want to talk to you about BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a highly reviewed online therapy platform, which means you can get the help you need right from the comfort of your own home. And then after filling out a brief survey online, BetterHelp will usually be able to match you with one of their licensed therapists within 24 hours. And then it's up to you how you communicate with your therapist. You can chat with your therapist on your phone, your computer, phone call, video call, messaging. It's totally up to you. So if you're struggling right now and you think therapy could help you too, think about giving BetterHelp a try. Let BetterHelp connect you with a therapist who can support you right from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/MrBallen or just click MrBallen during sign up to enjoy a special discount on your first month. On the morning of September 19th, 2013, a man named Mark Casey sat with his girlfriend, Lynn Spalding, in the triage area of the emergency room at San Francisco General Hospital. A nurse took Lynn's temperature and her blood pressure, while Mark tried to explain what had been going on with Lynn over the past few weeks. Lynn, who was now 57, had been dealing with this really intense stomach pain. And so she had gone to the doctor and she had been diagnosed with a urinary tract infection, and she was given antibiotics for it. But despite taking those antibiotics, it didn't get rid of the stomach pain. And in fact, her stomach pain was only getting worse. She was losing weight and she just seemed really frail. But despite her condition obviously getting worse every single day, Over the past few weeks, Lynn had basically refused to go back to the hospital, despite Mark saying, "We really gotta go, you're getting worse, we gotta have you looked at." But she just kept saying no. And then finally, when Mark noticed Lynn was now becoming somewhat despondent, like he would try to talk to her and her eyes would glaze over and she would look off into the distance like she didn't even hear him, Mark had just looked at Lynn and said, "You know what? I'm taking you to the hospital." And so he put her in the car, he brought her to the hospital, and now that he was here, he had to explain what was going on because Lynn was still despondent, just kind of staring off into space and very likely having no idea what was going on. And so after Mark gave all the information to the nurse said that, okay, Lynn needs to be admitted to the hospital. And so after a short wait, an orderly came over and pushed Lynn's wheelchair up to the 5th floor where she'd be staying, and Mark went with them. And then once in the room, Mark helped Lynn get settled in her bed. And again, Lynn is just kind of staring off into space, not really paying attention. And then a whole team of nurses and doctors came in and hooked Lynn up to IVs and different machines to make sure they could monitor her. And then at some point, one of the doctors pulled Mark aside and said, "We think Lynn is dealing with some kind of infection. And so what we need to do is run some tests to figure out what this infection is. And then hopefully we can treat it." And so Mark said, "Okay, that sounds great." And then all day, Mark sat right next to Lynn and held her hand as the medical team came in and out of the room running all these tests. The following day, the medical team still didn't know what was wrong with Lynn. The tests they had run so far were inconclusive or were negative. Now, the biggest issue with Lynn was not trying to figure out what infection she had or how to cure her. Instead, it was, how do we keep Lynn in her hospital room? Because on this second day that Lynn was at the hospital, despite being very despondent still, any chance she got, she was getting out of her bed and trying to escape her room. And so the medical team, they kept having to go find her and bring her back to her room. And they tried to explain to her, like, "Lynn, you're sick. That's why you're here. You need to stay in your room." But Lynn clearly was just not getting it. She was just not there. And she would just say to the team, "I want to go home. I just want to go home. I want to go home." And they would say, "Well, Lynn, you got to get better first, and then you can go home." Now, Mark, like the medical staff, was also concerned about Lynn's behavior. It was not safe for her to get up and flee her hospital room. But Mark kind of secretly thought, maybe this is a good sign, because the day before, Lynn couldn't even walk on her own. And now today, she's walking around on her own, trying to escape the hospital, which is bad. But, she's ambulatory. That's going to be a good sign. And also, Mark was thinking that because Lynn was fleeing her room over and over again, she's going to get even better medical care because the staff has to be super focused on her. And so Mark was feeling kind of optimistic that Lynn was on the road to recovery. The next morning, so now Lynn has been at the hospital for 2 days at this point, a nurse went into Lynn's room to check on her at about 10:15 a.m., and she walked up to Lynn, who was in her bed, and Lynn immediately told the nurse that she wanted to go home, and the nurse said, "Sorry, Lynn, we still don't know what's wrong with you. You got to stay here for now." But again, it was pretty clear Lynn did not understand what the nurse was saying. And so Lynn was not agitated. She was laying in bed and did not appear to, want to flee the room anytime soon. And so the nurse took Lynn's vitals. They were all basically normal. And then the nurse wrote down on Lynn's chart that her condition as of this moment was fair. And then the nurse left the room. And once this nurse was gone, Lynn laid in bed for a second. And then when nobody else came in the room, she sat up, she hopped off the bed, and she took off her hospital gown. She pulled out all the cords and wires that were on her. Then she put on her jeans, her boots, her jacket. She grabbed her purse off the table, and she walked out the door. And the second she walked out the door, she would have been in this long hallway, except her room was at the end of the hallway. So when she stepped out into that hallway, if she turned right, she would have seen a long, long stretch of hallway with other hospital rooms and lots of staff and doctors and nurses kind of walking around. But to her left, it would have been a dead end with a single blue door with a green exit sign over the top of it. And so Lynn, she steps into the hallway, she looks down the long side to the right, then she looks to the left, she sees the blue door, and she goes to the blue door, she opens it up, and she disappears inside. When the nurse came back to Lynn's room and saw she wasn't there, she reported Lynn missing. Now, remember, the hospital was well aware of the fact that Lynn had been trying to escape for the past 48 hours, and so nobody was really shocked by this. In fact, the hospital, their first move was to contact Mark, who had actually gone home the night before to get some real sleep and to take a shower. And so they contacted Mark and they said, "Hey, Lynn's not here. Is she with you?" And Mark was like, no, I'm home. She's not here. I have not seen her. I haven't talked to her. I have no idea where she is. And so the hospital at this point began this huge search in their building, just checking the entire property for Lynn, but there was no trace of her. And so the police were contacted and they launched a search both of the hospital grounds and also of the surrounding areas, and they too could not find a trace of Lynn. It was like Lynn just vanished into thin air. That is, until October 8th, 2013, so 17 days after Lynn had strolled through that blue exit door. On that day, October 8th, a hospital maintenance worker was walking down the long hallway in the hospital, not on the 5th floor where Lynn was staying, but one floor below, so on the 4th floor. And he's walking down this long hallway in the direction of the dead end side, so the same side that Lynn was on where her room was, but again, one floor above. And the maintenance worker, he walks all the way to the end of this hallway on the 4th floor, and he arrives in front of the blue door with the green exit sign above it. Again, this is below where Lynn was, but it looks the same. And the maintenance worker, he opened up the door, and when he looked out of the 4th floor door, he just froze because what he was looking at just seemed impossible. And then he had this urge to scream, but he knew there were all these patients and kids and doctors and stuff in the hallway behind him, and he didn't want to scare anyone. And so very quietly, he reached down and grabbed his radio, and he called for help. In order to explain what happened next, you need to look at this picture. So in this picture, on the right-hand side, you see there are two outdoor landings with people on them. The one on top is the 5th floor landing, and the one below it, with a single person on it, is the 4th floor landing. And to get onto these outdoor landings, you have to walk through those blue exit doors at the end of those hallways. These blue doors are emergency exits. And so when you go out these blue doors, once they shut, they lock automatically. But now you're out on this outdoor landing, and immediately to your right, although you can't see it in this picture, there is actually another door that leads to this enclosed stairwell that will bring you all the way to the ground floor, where there's another door that's unlocked that will bring you out to safety. And so again, you walk out one of those blue doors, you're on this landing, you can turn, open up another door, you're in the stairwell, and you can evacuate. So, in theory, if you were a person that really wanted to escape this hospital, like Lynn did, going out one of these blue door emergency exits was a great idea. It would bring you to the ground. This is a way to escape the hospital. But remember, Lynn was totally confused. Mentally, she was just not there because of whatever illness was affecting her. And so when she walked out that door, she arrived on the 5th floor landing, and the door shut behind her and it locked. And the theory is, as soon as Lynn got out there, maybe she had some second thoughts and wanted to go back into the hospital. And so she turned and she grabbed that door and tried to open it back up again, but because it locks automatically, it wouldn't open. And so Lynn did have the wherewithal to turn and see this other door that led to this enclosed stairwell, the emergency stairwell that did go to the ground floor. She could absolutely go all the way down and escape. She could do that. She went into the stairwell and she went down one floor to the 4th floor landing. And when she got there, she left the stairwell and she went to that door that would lead back into the hospital on the 4th floor. And she tried it, but of course it was locked. And then again, instead of her just going back into the stairwell and going down and escaping to safety, she, for some reason, just stayed on the 4th floor landing. Again, you got to remember that she's not all there mentally, and so she was confused, and she just stayed there on the landing, basically waiting to be rescued. But despite these huge searches of the hospital property by hospital staff and by the police, for some reason, this area, this landing on the 4th floor, was never checked. And so nobody found her. That is until October 4th. So at this point, Lynn has been outside for 13 days on this landing. And a researcher from the hospital, for whatever reason, exited out one of these emergency doors, and they began making their way downstairs. And when they passed by the 4th floor landing, they spotted Lynn on the ground on the 4th floor landing. But instead of going over to her and seeing if she was okay, this researcher just called security and said, hey, there's a patient outside on the 4th floor landing, like, come check it out. And then instead of waiting for security, the researcher just left, leaving Lynn alone. And security at the hospital, who said they were going to go check, They didn't. And so 4 more days would go by with still nobody officially finding Lynn. And then finally, on October 8th, the hospital maintenance worker opened up the blue door on the 4th floor, and he saw the 4th floor landing, that exterior landing, and he saw Lynn, and he knew she was dead. Officials were never able to determine when Lynn died, so it's not clear how long she was alive out on that landing. But it is possible she could have been alive when that researcher found her, but obviously help didn't come in time. Ultimately, Lynn's family would sue the city and the hospital, and they would be awarded $3 million. On May 28, 1986, a Florida real estate agent named Marguerite Welty walked up to the front door of this little white stucco home sitting right on the edge of Lake Placid in Florida. Marguerite pulled out a key from her pocket, she unlocked the door, opened it up, and then she turned around, and standing right in front of her were her clients, this young couple named Lois and Richard Goodman, who were thinking about buying a vacation home. And so this was one of the homes they were checking out. And so Marguerite smiled at her clients and gestured for them to come inside. The house sat at the end of a quiet, shady street lined with huge trees and other small vacation homes, and a lot of these vacation homes were perfectly manicured and beautiful, but the house they were touring today was not. It was unmaintained and overgrown, the paint was chipped and fading. It just looked bad, because the owner of this property at one time had used this house as their vacation home, but lately they had just kind of stopped coming out here, and so they really never came out to check on the property, and so it definitely had the look of an abandoned property. And now the owner didn't even know if they could fix it anymore, and so they decided they would just sell it and let somebody else deal with it. And so Marguerite led Richard and Lois into the house, and she brought them right into the carpeted living room, and the house was very musky and dark. All the windows were shut and all the blinds were drawn, and so Marguerite kind of instinctively walked over to the windows and began opening up the curtains and opening up the blinds, letting sunlight into the house. And so as this room is suddenly being lit up by the sunlight, behind her, Marguerite hears Lois and Richard start to laugh at something. And so Marguerite turned around to see what was so funny, and when she saw what Lois and Richard were laughing at, Marguerite did not think it was very funny. In fact, she thought the fact that they were laughing right now was kind of rude, especially when you considered what this couple had asked of Marguerite. They had come to Marguerite and said, hey, we want to buy a vacation home. It needs to be perfect. It needs to be on the water. It needs to have this and this and this. But we have a tiny budget. Go find us homes. And so Marguerite had really struggled to find vacation homes that were in their budget, but then she had found this diamond in the rough, this house on the coast of Lake Placid. It had 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, it had a garage, direct access to the water, it even had a boat dock. This house was perfect. Now, of course, this house had obvious downsides, like the fact that it was clearly a fixer-upper. Anybody who bought this home would have to put a lot of work into just making it livable again. And then also, there was a distinct weird vibe about the property itself. Because the owner was never there, they had covered all the furniture inside of this home with white sheets, which kind of gave it a sort of haunted house vibe. And then also, there was virtually nothing of value inside of this home, because again, the owner was like never here. But for some reason, there was this super intense security system on the house. There was cameras everywhere, and the windows had metal bars over them. And so the aesthetic inside and outside this house was not a good one. But again, Marguerite felt like if they could just look past the negative stuff, this was really the perfect place for them. But now, here Marguerite's clients were, laughing away at the kind of goofy interior of this home. It's like they were being totally disrespectful both to Marguerite and, frankly, to the owner of this property. This is a good opportunity. What are you doing? But ultimately, Marguerite couldn't force her clients to be appreciative of this. And so she just kind of laughed along with them, but then very quickly changed the subject and told them, hey, let's go walk around the rest of the house. Make sure you see the whole place before you pass judgment. But Marguerite only had to lead Richard and Lois around the house for a couple more minutes to figure out they definitely were not in the market for this house. They could not look past the bizarre, kind of spooky almost atmosphere inside the house and how run down it was. So they were just not going to put an offer on this house, and Marguerite knew it. And so even though Marguerite was definitely frustrated, she told her clients, don't worry about it. I'll go back to the drawing board. I'll find more properties and we'll check those out. And so Marguerite led Richard and Lois out of the property. She shut and locked the door behind her, and then she and her clients left. 2 days later, on May 30th, 1986, the owner of this rundown old vacation home came by to check on the property. Basically, because they were trying to sell it, they just wanted to go up and make sure there were no obviously bad things about the property. They knew it was in rough shape, but, they're just doing a sanity check. And so they get to this property, they open up the door, and they step inside, and right away, the owner is hit with this horrible smell. Now, the owner knew it normally did not smell great inside this home, but this smell he was smelling now was just so bad. It was so pungent, he knew it was not normal. And so the owner began walking around the house trying to figure out where the smell was coming from, and at some point he found himself in the living room, and his eyes happened to land on the thing that Richard and Lois Goodman had been laughing at 2 days earlier. Except when the owner saw this thing, he didn't think it was funny at all. In fact, what he did is he instantly turned around, ran out of the house, grabbed a phone, and called 911. 4 days earlier, on May 26th, a 28-year-old man named Thomas Lopez Ruiz, who was living in this makeshift campsite down by the water near Lake Placid, he decided to leave his campsite and go into town to try to earn some money. Thomas did not have a steady job. Instead, he did odd jobs in town whenever he could to earn a few bucks. But on this day, when Thomas went into town, there was no work. So Thomas decided he would go rob one of the many vacation homes along the coastline of Lake Placid. And the home that he picked is the same vacation home that Marguerite would take the Goodmans to 2 days later. And so Thomas arrives in front of this overgrown property, and he tries the doors and they're all locked. However, Thomas had a plan. Thomas was a pretty small guy. He was about 5 foot 2 inches tall, only weighed about 140 pounds. And so he figured he could just slip through the chimney. That's how he could break into the house. And at first it went great. He slipped in no problem. And before long, he was making his way down towards the inside of the house. But what Thomas realized as he went down the chimney is the chimney was not perfectly straight up and down. Instead, it was sort of tapered, where at the top it was wide, but the deeper you got, so the farther down you went in the chimney, the narrower the inside of the chimney got. And so when Thomas was almost all the way down the chimney, he got stuck. He could not get the rest of the way down, but where he got stuck, he couldn't grab the top of the chimney. He couldn't pull himself out. And so he is absolutely wedged, can't go down, can't go up, and making matters even worse was every time he exhaled, his chest would shrink a little bit, and that would cause him to slip a little bit farther, a little bit deeper into the chimney, and then when he would try to breathe in again, his chest would not be able to fully expand again. And so basically, every second that went by, Thomas was sinking lower and lower and lower by little bits, making it harder and harder and harder to breathe. And you got to figure that he was screaming for help, which again was causing him to breathe a bunch, causing him to sink even farther. And so it would have made breathing extremely difficult. And so Thomas is like in this absolute claustrophobic nightmare. And without outside help, he had no chance of survival. 2 days later, Marguerite Welty brought the Goodmans into that property, and she would open up the blinds, and sunlight would come into the living room, and Marguerite would hear Lois and Richard laughing at something, and she would turn around, and she would see they were pointing at the fireplace, and visible in this fireplace were 2 legs dangling down inside the chimney. They were not so far down that they were touching the ground. They were just kind of suspended in the air. And Lois and Richard, based on the way the house looked already, the kind of spooky vibe, there's white sheets over all the furniture. There are these bars on all the windows. Everything is dark and dirty and kind of gross. Like there's this haunted house vibe to this place. And they're thinking, this must be a Halloween decoration or some sort of prank, a mannequin kind of jammed up into the chimney, maybe to look like a robber breaking into your house or something that the owner never took down, because clearly the owner stopped taking care care of this property, and so it kind of makes sense that these decorations would be left out. And so Lois and Richard are laughing at this Halloween decoration, and Marguerite, she looks at the legs too, and also thinks they're just some Halloween decoration, doesn't think anything of it, and so finally they end up leaving, and that was it. But, as I'm sure you all have guessed, of course those legs were not mannequin legs, those were Thomas's legs. And in fact, the creepiest part about this is Thomas may have been alive during the house tour. The autopsy showed he actually did not die of asphyxiation, so he didn't suffocate. He died from dehydration, which takes about 2 days, and this house tour was about 2 days in. And the day prior to the house tour, a neighbor had been outside and they thought they heard someone yelling inside of the property, but for some reason, the neighbor just didn't do anything about it. And so there's a pretty good chance Thomas was barely alive as they were touring the house. But, by the time the owner came back 2 days later and smelled that horrible smell, Thomas had passed away, and that smell was the smell of his body decomposing. Also, just to close the loop on this, it's not clear why the homeowner had that really aggressive security system with the bars on the windows. He just did. On the morning of May, sure you check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that has hundreds more stories you can listen to right now, and many of those stories are only available on that podcast. They are not on this YouTube channel. So again, that podcast is called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available on every podcast platform. Okay, until next time, thank you so much. See ya. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you liked today's video about places you can't go, well, you're in luck because we have a whole series of them. Click here. Morning in 1993, a surfer named John Doyle was sitting on a surfboard out in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of West Africa, just scanning the water waiting for a wave. John was totally alone out here. There were no other surfers, nothing, and the only sign of human civilization anywhere was John's Land Rover, which was parked up on the sand on the beach. John was an American. He was from Colorado, and so his experience had always been, lots of snow and mountains and trees, because that's Colorado. But now here, off the coast of Africa, it was like a totally different planet. And in fact, today, John was really feeling that because the sun was so hot that day. It was over 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and he could actually feel his back starting to burn as he sat there, waiting for the next wave. And so he told himself, actually, that he would just catch one more wave and then call it a day to avoid a sunburn. But as John continued to kind of scan out across the water waiting for this wave, he noticed about 20 meters away was a shark fin swimming in a circle, like stereotypical terrifying shark behavior. And so John is horrified and he wants to get out of the water immediately, but he's far enough away from shore that if he jumped into the water to swim to shore, he's going to be in the water with the shark thrashing around. He's just going to attract the shark over to him. And so John decides his only hope here to escape the shark is actually just to surf in. That way he'll stay out of the water. It's much faster. He'll get to shore. The shark can't follow him there. It'll be fine. And so, trying to stay calm, John continued to keep his eye on the shark that was still 20 meters away, and he also really looked closely for any swell coming towards him that might be big enough to allow him to surf to shore. And thankfully, after only a couple of minutes, John did see a swell coming towards him that seemed like it would be perfect for a final wave. And so at this point, John is facing out to sea towards the swell, towards the shark that's still 20 meters away, and he turns himself around, so he's facing towards shore, and then he lays down on his stomach and he begins to paddle towards shore. And as he's doing this, he's checking the swell to see when it's going to come up, when he can stand up, and eventually the swell is right underneath him, and as he's about to stand up on his board and actually surf into shore, he looks into the water that has not quite formed into a wave yet, and he sees the shark. It's literally underneath him. And so John has this sudden surge of adrenaline and he just jumps up onto his board. He stands up and for a second, he's stable. He's surfing and he's riding this wave away from the shark. He's doing exactly what he hoped he could do. He can't believe it. And then, because he was panicked, because he was rushing, because it was a new board, who knows why, the nose of his board suddenly dipped just long enough to throw John off his board and into the water with the shark. And so immediately, as this wave is churning John over, he grabs onto his surfboard and just kind of holds on, and he's waiting for a moment when the wave stops so he can get out of the water, back on his board, and away from the shark. But before the wave even stopped tumbling him over, John suddenly felt the searing pain in his calf. And so John, who's underwater, still clutching his board, he opens his eyes underwater, then he looks down, and through the cloudy water, he can see very clearly it is the shark, and it's a great white shark that is latched on to his leg. And so now, in a total panic, John began punching the nose of the shark. And when he did, the shark actually recoiled and released his leg long enough that John could pull it out. He actually managed to get up onto his board again. And just a second later, almost out of instinct, he was back standing on his board, just surfing along with a leg that was now bleeding profusely into the water. And for a second, John was stable and appeared to be kind of moving towards shore again, but then the shark, it doubled around and swam at John from the side and literally smashed into him, knocking him off the board back into the water. But this time, John managed, when he fell this second time, to actually grab on to the board with both hands. So he has two hands on the board, he's getting tumbled in the water again, but he knows the shark is going to come for him. And so at the last second, he pulled the board close to his body and kind of turned himself like it was a shield. And the shark came flying towards him and bit him. But because he used that surfboard as a shield, the shark just bit the surfboard, ripped off half of it and swam off with it and began mauling this half of the surfboard. And John, with the other half of the surfboard, he somehow managed to stand up on it. Again, his leg is bleeding everywhere, and he rode this damaged half surfboard into shore successfully away from the shark. And so when John pulled himself up onto the sand, out of the water, he looked back and he saw the shark swimming off. And even though he's in excruciating pain from this attack, he was so relieved. He couldn't believe he actually just survived that. But John did not have time to think about, what good fortune this was in a way, because he was an hour away from the nearest civilization. And between where he was now and that town, there was nothing. There weren't homes, there weren't buildings, there weren't offices, nothing. It was just totally wildlands until you got to that town. And so John knew he would need to get in his car and drive all the way to that town and then get the people of the town to go get medical help. So, he is hours away from getting the help he needs. And so he has no time to waste. And so he crawls through the sand. His leg is killing him, but he's just so focused on getting up to his Land Rover. And he manages to get to his car. He opens the door. He climbs in the driver's seat. And then as soon as he's in there, he shuts and locks the doors. And then he grabs a white t-shirt that he had on the passenger seat and he ripped it into strips. And he used those strips like tourniquets and he wrapped them around his leg, the leg that was bleeding from his calf. And he basically used this tourniquet to attempt to cut off blood flow to his entire right leg to stop the bleeding, to save his life. But the wound on his right leg was so bad and so deep that despite putting on multiple very tight tourniquets, it just wasn't doing very much. He was still losing blood at a pace that likely would kill him before he got to town. And so John was kind of like, well, nothing else I can do but attempt to go to town. So he fired up his car, he reversed off the beach, and began making his way towards town. As John sped along the road, he began to feel very lightheaded. Between the pain in his leg and the extreme heat outside, he just felt very dehydrated and weak. And so he thought to himself, if I can't get a sip of water soon, I'm going to pass out right now, and then I'm done for. And so as he's driving along, John began fumbling around his car, looking for any sort of liquid somewhere in the car. But ultimately, all he found was an empty water bottle. And all he saw in every direction was just this barren African savanna with no people and no water anywhere. And so John just kept on driving, hoping eventually he might find some water source. And luckily, after only a couple of minutes, when his eyelids were really starting to droop and he was having a hard time focusing, he noticed up ahead there was a copse of trees with a little creek that ran through it. And so immediately John pulled over and he got out and he hobbled his way over to the water. He laid down on his stomach so his face is basically right over the water. And then he just put his face in the water and began to drink. And as he did, he felt his heart rate start to slow down. He felt himself relax a little bit. And he started to think to himself like, hey, I found water, I'm doing okay. Maybe I will survive this. But right as John was starting to feel optimistic, he felt a new shooting pain on his right side. And so with a little bit of strength he had, he managed to turn his head and looked to see what was going on. And staring back at him was a lion who had just bit his side and was now growling and staring at John and beginning to move its jaw left and right to really sink its teeth into John. Okay, so if you're not listening to our show called Run Fool, then you are really missing out on a truly special and unique podcast. Now, it's technically a horror podcast, but honestly, it's so much more. Every episode is a fresh take on terrifying lore, like a modern ghost story wrapped up in a tightly spun narrative. Also, remember, Run Fool is a Ballen Studios podcast, which means there's always going to be a big plot twist or reveal at the end. Rodney Barnes is the iconic host of Run Fool, and every story he tells on there, it feels like this fully immersive horror movie. Also, the sound design on this show is like expert level. Barnes really knows what he's doing. Even if you never watch the show, you should tune in just for a second, at least once, just to hear Barnes's radio voice. It is like the best, most soothing voice I think I've ever heard. So if Run Fool feels like a show you might like, go run and follow the show and start listening. Also, be sure you stick around till the end of today's video because we're going to play a clip from last week's episode of Run Fool. Now, this is unbelievably painful for John, and he's already dealing with an unbelievable pain in his leg from the shark attack, and so John's experiencing pain that very few people ever get to experience, and it caused this unbelievable surge of adrenaline, one that you would likely get basically right before you die. That was the level of adrenaline he was getting, and with this adrenaline rush, he grabbed a stick and he began hitting this lion who's locked onto his ribs, and he managed to beat the lion off of him. And the lion, it only backed up maybe a few feet, and it's still totally fixated on John, and it's growling and edging towards him. But John, all he could do was just attempt to get to his Land Rover. And so as soon as the lion had let go of him, he just stood up and kind of pathetically began hobbling as fast as he could towards his Land Rover. And he literally just walked past this lion who's still growling at him, kind of trying to size him up. And he just kept on walking towards his car, and he was almost there when he noticed the sound of the lion growling behind him, which had been constant to this point, had suddenly intensified to the point where John couldn't even help himself. He had to turn around and see what was going on. And when he turned around, he saw now there was not just one lion, but an entire pride of lions. There was at least 4 lions that now had all formed a semicircle and were staring at John and moving towards him to eat him. But John really couldn't do anything about this. All he could do was just hopefully get to his Land Rover in time. And so John just turned back around so his back is to the pride of lions a few feet away from him, and he just continues hobbling towards his car. And as he walked, the lions began swiping at him and cutting his legs open and his arms open. I mean, they're like razor blades just being taken to the backside of him, but they didn't launch a full-bore attack on him. It was like they were just kind of testing him. And then right when the lions were basically about to actually pull John to the ground and eat him, was when John got to the door, opened it up, jumped inside, shut it, and locked it. However, when John went to grab his keys and start the car, he realized he didn't have the keys. And when he turned and looked outside, he saw the pride of lions and his car keys on the ground. He was doomed. He knew there was no way he could get those keys without getting killed in the process. And so John basically just resigned himself to die in his car right here. Like he knew, I'm going to die in the next few hours. There's nothing I can do. And so he just kind of sat there and waited. And 30 minutes later, John heard a very loud, almost explosion sound coming from somewhere outside of the vehicle. And then he heard it a few more times, and before long, the lions were so startled by it that they ran away. And then he hears what sounds like a series of shutter flashes, like camera flashes. And he's looking around, he can't quite figure out what's even going on, because again, he has all these injuries, he's lost so much blood. And then eventually, John just kind of passes out, having no idea what had just happened. It would turn out there was actually a safari that was happening in the area where John was at the same time, and the safari guide, as they drove past this area, happened to spot John inside of his Land Rover surrounded by lions. And so as all the people in the tour began furiously taking photos of this crazy scene in front of them, the tour guide began firing his rifle into the sky to scare the lions off. And so those were the noises that John was hearing before he passed out. And then after he passed out, the tour guide and all the people on the tour pulled John out of his Land Rover, because now the lions are gone, and they would take him to a hospital where doctors and nurses would have to give him 250 stitches to stitch up all of his various shark and lion wounds. John would make a full recovery, and he would hang up on his wall in his office the broken half of that surfboard that he did successfully manage to ride in to escape the shark. He says the surfboard reminds him how lucky he was. As promised, here is a clip from last week's episode of our amazing podcast, Run Fool, hosted by the incredible, iconic storyteller, Rodney Barnes. Enjoy.
That's when Uma flew in for some damage control. Her tone was polite but firm as she informed the outsider that this was a private party. He needed to leave. Ethan flinched. This was so embarrassing. Was he going to get kicked out next? But the outsider didn't seem bothered. He asked again where Dr. Smith was.
Where is he?
Uma grabbed his elbow and pulled him towards the exit. That's when the man lost it. He ripped his arm from Uma and backed away, trembling. His mouth quivered. His eyes leaked fear. He opened his mouth and screamed. The wail cut through Ethan's head like a knife. He yelped and covered his ears with his palms. The other guests did too. So did Uma. But she looked wrong. Her head shook back and forth. It picked up speed until her features became a blur. Ethan could hear her choking, too. Loud, hacking gasp as her throat struggled to keep up with the unnatural movement. Her trembling hands moved to her cheeks, a futile attempt to stop whatever was happening.
February 4th, 1991, a taxicab driver named Wang was chatting with the taxi dispatcher at headquarters when suddenly, for no clear reason, the dispatcher stopped talking to Wang and just began staring intently at something behind Wang. And so Wang noticed this, and right away he turned around to see what it was he was looking at. But all Wang could see was just a window that looked out to this huge fenced-in parking lot that was full of taxi cabs and their drivers. This is where they would go to wait for fares. And where the taxi headquarters were located was right near the airport in a very busy city called Kaohsiung City in Taiwan. And so taxi cabs in this area were really in high demand. And so as Wang looked out at the very busy parking lot full of drivers talking to potential customers, to Wang, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was just a typical busy day. But when Wang kind of looked at the dispatcher like, I don't really see what you see, the dispatcher just raised his finger and kind of pointed in the direction that he was staring. And so Wang turned around again, and this time, when he looked in the direction the dispatcher was pointing, he could see immediately why the dispatcher was reacting the way he was. Because the dispatcher was pointing at one of their colleagues, so another taxi driver, whose name was Leo Shui Chung, and as Wang looked out at him, he saw Leo was sprinting across this very busy parking lot full of all these cabs and drivers and customers, and Leo was clutching this big golden statue of Buddha in his arms as he ran. And so Wang and the dispatcher watched Leo, and what he did is he kept running all the way across the lot until he got to his taxi cab, at which point he practically dove inside of it. He slammed the door, locked every door, and then began looking around frantically like he was expecting someone to show up who had been chasing him or something. But there was nobody around his car, and Wang and the dispatcher kind of scanned the parking lot, and they didn't see anybody who seemed remotely interested in Leo. And so Wang and the dispatcher continued to watch Leo from the window, and they saw eventually Leo stopped kind of scanning around for other people, and at that point he took that golden statue of Buddha and he placed it up on the dash of his cab. And this was not the first Buddha statue that he had put up there. From Wang and the dispatcher's perspective, it looked like he had at least 2 or 3 that were right up there alongside this new one. And then after Leo placed this new golden statue, he sort of sat back in his chair, and from Wang and the dispatcher's perspective, perspective, it sort of looked like he had closed his eyes and was praying or mumbling something, but, whatever he was doing, it just seemed kind of odd. And so eventually, Wang and the dispatcher stopped watching Leo, who still just continued to sit back in his chair and, mumble or pray or something. And then Wang and the dispatcher looked at each other and they exchanged very concerned looks, because they both knew, Leo was kind of a weird guy, but from his behavior today, it just seemed like, something must be wrong with Leo. There has to be some issue. So for context, Leo was this 35-year-old guy who lived alone, and he had this reputation of being very antisocial and kind of just rude. Like, he had terrible manners. But recently, Wang and the dispatcher and other taxi drivers who worked at this company had noticed that Leo's behavior had gone from being kind of awkward and antisocial to being kind of menacing, like not even including the weird behavior he was exhibiting now, just like in his day-to-day interactions with people. He was just really aggressive. Like, he always would tell his colleagues at the taxi company how much he hated stray cats and dogs. And, a lot of people found these stray cats and dogs in their neighborhood in the city to be a bit of a nuisance. They'd rummage through trash and make noise or whatever, but nobody really paid them much attention. They were just stray animals trying to survive. Like, it wasn't a big deal. But for Leo, he obsessed over hating the stray cats and dogs and how much he wanted them to get out of his neighborhood. And somewhat recently, he had come to work and told his colleagues that he had gone out and gotten a crossbow, and at night he had begun shooting at the stray cats and dogs, which totally horrified his colleagues. And now Leo had this weird thing going on with his Buddha statues that he was putting inside of his cab. And also, in addition to those statues, he had begun putting on the windows inside of his cab these things called fulus, which are these little strips of yellow parchment paper that basically ward off evil spirits. And so Leo had basically transformed the interior of his cab into this sort of weird shrine or temple. And in fact, Leo had put up so many of these fulus on the inside of the windows, and again, all those statues that sat on the dash, that when he drove, he could barely see because his view was totally obstructed. But despite everybody at the company seeing this totally weird behavior playing out with Leo, nobody went up to him and said, "Hey, what are you doing with these statues and pieces of paper? What's going on here?" Because nobody wanted to interact with him. He seemed like kind of a menace, and so people just kind of let him do his thing. But now, as Wang and the dispatcher are watching Leo run across the lot and act totally psychotic, they looked at each other and they were like, maybe we should do something. And so Wang volunteered to call the police, and as Wang turned to go walk out and make the call, he saw Leo peeling out of the parking lot, nearly smashing into cars and people, just driving like a total maniac. And so Leo really felt like, okay, yeah, this really is the time to step in. Someone's gonna get hurt here. The following day, Wang would contact his friend in the police department, and he would explain what was going on with Leo. And to Wang's surprise, his friend told him that actually the police were well aware of Leo. And that was because not all that long ago, Leo was actually a suspect in a murder case. So about 10 months earlier, in April of 1990, a 23-year-old woman from Japan named Mariko Iguchi had visited Taiwan on vacation, and during this vacation, she had gone missing. Now, at the time, the Taiwanese economy really relied heavily on Japanese tourism, and so Taiwan really aggressively marketed to Japan to, come visit, come on vacation here. And so it was pretty common for Japanese college students to visit Taiwan on vacation to celebrate things like a graduation or a birthday party. And so that's what Mariko was doing. She was here celebrating, and she was traveling alone. Also, one sort of quirky thing about Taiwanese culture at the time was it was pretty common for taxi cab drivers to open up their own personal homes to their fares, basically saying, hey, don't stay at a hotel, I'll give you a ride wherever you're gonna go, but then at night, you can stay at my house with my family. And so it was just kind of a thing in Taiwan that people visited and stayed at the homes of their taxi cab drivers. So when Mariko came to Taiwan on this vacation, this is what she did. She stayed in the home of the taxi cab driver, and it was during this period of time that she went missing. And so naturally, when the investigation began into her disappearance, the first place police went were the taxi cab drivers. And so first, the police focused on a driver in the capital of Taiwan who said he had given Mariko a few rides, he had brought her sightseeing, and then he had let her stay in his home. But he said, after that, she left and he didn't see her again. He had no idea what happened to her. And the police would actually discover that after Mariko left that particular driver's house, she would send a postcard to her family that was dated after she had left. And so basically this ruled out the first driver as a suspect. And so for a little while, this case went cold because the police couldn't find any other taxicab drivers that had given Mariko a ride. But then, a few months later, the police offered a reward for information about what happened to Mariko, and it was then that police got a tip that Mariko had been seen speaking to Leo at the train station before she disappeared. But when police spoke to Leo, he immediately said, yes, I did give Mariko a ride, but that was it. She didn't stay at my house. It was just this one ride from the train station into town, and after she got out, I have no idea what happened to her. And so police would ask Leo dozens more questions and they would try to get more information from him, but he just didn't have any. And then at the same time, there was this flood of all these new tips that began coming into the police station about this case. But it would turn out a lot of these leads, like all of them, were just terrible tips. People were calling in totally random stuff just because now there was this monetary reward for information, and it was kind of incentivizing people to just call in anything. And it was actually making the investigation much harder because now the police had all these bad tips, and so they really weren't getting anywhere. But despite the slow progress the police were making in this case had really been elevated and become like a huge international news story, and lots of people all over the world were following it. And during this time, when all these people are tuned in to this case, really weird things began happening surrounding this case. People in the city began receiving all these strange phone calls from this kind of frantic woman speaking Japanese. And in Taiwan, people predominantly speak Taiwanese and Mandarin, not Japanese. So this is a weird phone call to be getting in Taiwan. And also at this time, you need to remember that Mariko's disappearance was kind of all over the news. And so to get these weird calls from a woman speaking Japanese who sounds totally frantic, it made people in the city believe that it was Mariko placing these strange phone calls. But these calls, they didn't make any sense. It was just a woman kind of yelling in Japanese, and then she would just abruptly hang up. And also there were all these reports of people claiming to have seen Mariko or heard Mariko just in the city walking around. None of it was substantiated, but there was just kind of this eerie quality to the case. And so when Wang called his friend at the police department to report Leo for his totally weird behavior, this was at a time when the Mariko missing person case was still totally front of mind in Taiwan and around the world, and also the police were still actively investigating this case, and frankly, Leo had not been ruled out as a suspect in this case. He was not considered a primary suspect by any means, but he wasn't ruled out yet, and so the police are hearing that Leo's acting really funny, and it made them think, hey, maybe we should reinvestigate this guy and see if he really is connected to the Mariko missing person case. And so ultimately, after Wang hung up, his friend in the police department got in touch with the lead detective on the Mariko case and told him about what was going on with Leo. And this lead detective, whose name was Lin Xiaoji, decided he would just put Leo under surveillance to see what he was doing. Last year, my wife and I decided to do some home renovations. However, we didn't really have the cash to pay for it, so we knew we would need a loan. But when I began looking into getting a loan, it was obvious there were lots of opportunities to be taken advantage of by predatory traditional lenders. So I decided I would seek out the funds in another way, and that was to leap into the ocean and see if any of the various sea creatures out there would be willing to give me the money. And luckily, after being in the ocean only for a couple of minutes, I spotted a very suave-looking 13-foot-long mako shark in a leather jacket smoking a cigarette who quickly flagged me down and said, yeah, I'll happily lend you the money, no problem. I was thrilled. That is, until I got home and checked my bank account, and I could see very clearly that that very cool shark was no good Samaritan. He was a predatory loan shark, and he was already drastically hiking my rates. And so I knew I would have to consolidate my debt ASAP if I ever wanted to extract myself from this evil shark's grasp. And that's when I found PDS debt. PDS Debt provides options that consolidate your debts into one low monthly payment. They're also a top-rated company on Google, and they have an A+ rating on the Better Business Bureau. PDS Debt has customized options for anyone struggling with credit cards, personal loans, collections, or medical bills. It'll help you save thousands of dollars in interest and fees, and it'll help you pay off your debt in a fraction of the time. PDS Debt is offering a free debt assessment. It only takes 30 seconds. All you gotta do is head over to pdsdebt.com/MrBallen to get your free debt analysis today. So, starting sometime in the middle of February of 1991, Detective Lin and a few of his colleagues began taking turns trailing Leo basically 24/7. And so the police just kept their distance and they followed Leo all around the city as he picked up his fares. And, the police never got out to talk to any of the fares, to get insights into whatever Leo might have been saying inside the cab. They just kind of watched from a distance and just wanted to see if there was any obvious red flags. Detective Lin figured, if Leo was somehow involved in whatever happened to Mariko, let's say she was killed, and let's say Leo was responsible for killing her, maybe if they followed Leo long enough, he might drive to an area that was kind of connected to her murder, maybe her gravesite or the place where he killed her or something. Going to kind of strange random locations without a fare would likely be an indication to police that that was a place of interest. But as the police tailed Leo, that's not what he did. Leo basically never ever left his cab. Leo basically just picked up a passenger, drove them where they needed to go, and then repeated over and over and over again all day long. And then at the end of the night, instead of going home to his apartment that police knew he had, he would just sleep inside of his cab, just like in parking lots and stuff. And the only times he would go into his apartment appeared to be just so he could go to the bathroom or maybe shower or something, because they would see him through the window. But whenever Leo went into his apartment, he went through the same totally weird ritual every time. He would be in his cab, parked out front of his apartment, and the police are, parked far enough away that they can watch this. And Leo, at some point, would begin kind of frantically looking all around him, as if he was looking for somebody who was trying to hurt him or who was spying on him or something. And then after kind of making sure the coast was clear, Leo would open up his door and sprint, like absolutely as fast as he could, into his apartment building, and he'd only be in there for like a couple of minutes before he'd come bombing back out and practically dive into his cab, and he would shut all the doors, lock all the doors, and then, he'd clutch his golden statues, and he'd rub his fulus that were taped all over the inside of his cab, and he'd continue frantically looking around, to make sure nobody was there to hurt him or something. And then after a little while, he'd kind of calm down, he'd put his statue back on the dash, he'd kind of make sure his fulus were all in place, and then he would drive away. So, of course, Leo's behavior, from the police's perspective, was totally bizarre, but in Detective Lin's mind, it didn't really seem like the behavior of a murderer. It seemed more like the behavior of someone who had lost their mind. Finally, on March 4th, 1991, Detective Lin decided that he just needed to speak to Leo, which required, basically ambushing Leo. So Detective Lin coordinated with his officers who were out surveilling Leo, and he had them tell him when Leo was at his apartment, going in to use the bathroom. And when they called in to Detective Lin that, hey, he just got to his apartment, he's about to run inside, Detective Lin and some other officers raced to the apartment, and they were all ready outside for whenever Leo came running back out to dive back into his cab. They were going to intercept him. And now Detective Lin and his colleagues didn't really know how Leo was going to react to having all these police standing there ready to grab him. I mean, was this guy going to be hostile? Was he going to be aggressive? Was he going to be scared, sad? They had no idea. It just seemed like Leo was totally unstable, so they all kind of had to be ready for whatever reaction he was going to have. However, the way Leo ultimately reacted to this was not the way any of the officers suspected. When Leo came bombing out of his apartment after a very short bathroom break, he began charging down the stairs towards his cab, and then seemed to kind of realize there were all these detectives and police officers all standing in front of him, literally getting ready to grab him, and Leo just collapsed to his knees and began sobbing and thanking them over and over and over again. Now, Detective Lin had no idea what this was. He didn't really understand what Leo was thanking them for, but he didn't waste any time trying to figure out what was going on. Instead, Detective Lin just went up to Leo and said, hey, we need to speak to you at the station. Will you come with us? And Leo was like, of course I will. Of course I will. And so Detective Lin drove Liao to the police station, and when they got there, Liao was saying things like, oh, I wish I could just stay at the police station with you all. Like, this is where I'm safe. I want to stay here. Now, Lin didn't really respond to this. He just kind of said, okay, yeah. And then they went inside together to head towards the interview room, and as they're walking there, Liao is saying over and over again to Detective Lin and any of the officers he passes by, thank you so much, you're my savior, thank you. Now, the police had no idea why Liao was treating them like his saviors, because to them, they're like, dude, we just ambushed you and brought you to the police station to question you about potentially being involved in a murder, so I don't know how we saved you. But it would turn out Liao had a really compelling reason to believe they really had just saved him. Because it would turn out Liao had this absolutely terrifying thing happening inside of his apartment. Just several minutes earlier, when Liao had run into his apartment, so right before he charged back outside and police grabbed him and took him to the station, when he was still inside of his apartment, he stepped inside and the apartment was totally dark. All the lights are off, all the shades are drawn, and immediately Liao felt his heart starting to race. And he looked around his apartment and it was totally silent, but then he heard it. He could hear on the far side of his apartment, in a room that he couldn't quite see into, the sound of breathing. But Liao lives alone. There shouldn't be anybody here. He has no pets, there's nobody here, but he hears breathing in another room. But Liao knew there was nothing he could do. The only thing he could do was just try to get in there, go to the bathroom, and get out as quickly as possible. And so very slowly, Liao began kind of tiptoeing across the living room floor, kind of making sure to stay out of eyesight of the doorway that led into the room where the breathing was coming from. And as soon as he kind of got past an area where he could be seen from the doorway, he ran the rest of the way down the hallway. He cut into the bathroom and shut the door and locked it. And then as quickly as he could, he did his business. He used a washcloth to clean himself because he didn't have time to take a shower because of what was going on inside of his apartment. And then once he was all done, he took a deep breath and then he opened up the door. And this time, the apartment was absolutely silent. There was no more breathing. And so Liao, thinking he had this opportunity to get out of here without being caught by this thing inside of his apartment, he turned and just started running towards the door. And as soon as he did, he began to hear a voice, a hoarse female voice, screaming at him from the other side of his apartment, screeching, why? And as Liao is just about to get to the door, he turns and he sees Mariko, the missing woman, running with her hair all knotted and matted, hanging over her face, sprinting towards him from that back room. And Liao, he only managed to barely get out of his apartment and shut it and lock it before she ran into the door. And then it went silent again. This is why Liao was acting totally crazy, because he was terrified of what he believed was like this demonic entity inside of his apartment. He didn't think that was a real person. He thought it was like the spirit of Mariko or something, and she was haunting him. And so he had no idea what to do. He didn't know who to tell, and he just began living out of his cab instead of dealing with whatever was going on in his apartment. And so when Liao charged outside after this latest encounter with Mariko, he sees the police, and Liao is just overwhelmed with relief. Hopefully, he's thinking they can get rid of her and his life can go back to normal. But as overjoyed as Liao appeared to be, and now having the police on his side, finally being able to deal with whatever was going on, when push came to shove, Liao actually did not feel comfortable immediately giving up details of whatever was going on with Mariko inside of his apartment. But as Liao was brought by Detective Lin to the police station to tell them what was going on with how Mariko was in his apartment and she was haunting him, it seemed like it was the ghost of her or something. As Liao was having that conversation, other police officers were sent to Liao's apartment to go see if maybe Mariko really was in his apartment. Maybe that's where she had been this whole time. Maybe she broke into this guy's apartment and was just squatting there and harassing him, and that was the mystery. That's where she's been. But when police went into Liao's apartment, there was no sign whatsoever that anybody else besides Liao was living in that apartment. There was no sign of a break-in. There was nothing. It was just Liao's apartment. And so this made police really suspicious of Liao because his story was so outrageous, and also he's talking about a person who's actively missing, Mariko. And so the police really pressured Liao to, come forward, give us more information. Why did you say this is Mariko in your apartment? Because there's nobody in your apartment. apartment? Tell us what's going on here. And so finally, after 4 days of intense questioning of Liao did finally admit to police that there was more to this story. It would turn out Liao really did pick Mariko up at the train station when she arrived in Taiwan for her vacation. So he did give her a ride, just like he said he had. But Liao had lied about what happened after that. It would turn out, after giving her this ride, Liao stayed with Mariko and they went sightseeing together, and then Liao invited Mariko to stay with him at his apartment, which again was customary in Taiwan. And so Mariko said yes, and she went to his apartment in the evening. And while they were there, Liao did proposition Mariko, and she rejected him. And at first, Liao just let it go, but then after Mariko fell asleep that night, he got his crossbow that he used to shoot dogs and cats, and he went into her room and he shot her 4 times with the crossbow, and then cut her head off. Liao would bury her body the following night, but that same night was the first time Liao began hearing the breathing in his apartment. He couldn't quite place it. And then, not long after that, the head of Mariko, the severed head, would chase him all around his apartment, screaming, why, at him. And so basically, Mariko's severed head began haunting Liao incessantly, to the point where he moved into his taxi cab and put up all those fulu papers to protect him from evil spirits, and also put up all those statues of Buddha for the same reason. I mean, he was living in his cab to protect himself from what he believed was this evil spirit. And so when people saw Liao in his cab kind of sitting back and muttering to himself, that was him praying that he would live through whatever was going on with this head. Liao would tell police where he buried Mariko's body, and he would tell police he buried her entire body in one location, including her head. But when police dug her up, it was only her lower half. Her head was missing. Liao was convicted of murder, and to this day, he is still in prison. Many people in Taiwan believe that, this case was ultimately solved because of Mariko's spirit, that she played a big role. Her head haunting Liao is what drove him crazy to the point where he admitted to police what he did. And then also, people in Taiwan think all those strange phone calls they were getting from that woman who was speaking Japanese and acting frantic and then hanging up, they say that was Mariko's spirit too, that was maybe one of her attempts just to keep people engaged with the story so that it wouldn't fade and become a cold case. And in fact, even some of the police, including Detective Lin, say they do believe Mariko's spirit played a role. And in fact, Detective Lin said at one point when he was inside of Liao's apartment, he was by himself and he felt someone push him on the back. And when he turned around, there was nobody there. And so he was convinced that Mariko's spirit was inhabiting that apartment. Our newest podcast out of Ballen Studios is already a major hit. It's called Run Fool, and it's hosted by horror icon and master storyteller Rodney Barnes. And in every episode, Rodney weaves together these totally unsettling and terrifying stories about witches and demons and monsters and ghosts. And so far, the feedback we're getting on the show is that Rodney is so good at slowly ratcheting up the fear in the episode. And so when you get to the end of the show, you're like genuinely terrified. And if that wasn't enough to at least pique your interest in the show, well then you should tune into it just to hear the sound design. Rodney and his team, they built these super creepy soundscapes, and it's just unlike any other show I've listened to. So please go follow and start listening to Run Fool on any podcast platform. So that's